It was nearly morning. The hospital windows shimmered in the early dawn light as Cleus Lupin looked around him. On the lowest floor deep in the basement of St. Mungo's, it would be a naive person who thought that the reason people who had been bitten by half-breeds were given beds down here was to protect them from any danger. Despite his first impressions, however, Cleus didn't find his brother in a dingy dark corner hidden away. In fact, the room could hardly have been more spacious. Every need was catered for down here. Every need. On the shelves adjacent Remus sat several vials of very thick red wine. At least, Cleus hoped they were red wine. He refused to let his mind consider what exactly they could be. Looking back to Remus as he held his brother's hand, Cleus smiled as he thought of the positive angle in all of this. His brother, and Sirius Black, lying adjacent and also unconscious, might have been dead. Septimus might have lost his father, so Cleus was determined to think that the situation wasn't all bad. Another advantage was that he wasn't at the cottage contemplating that evening's meeting at Grimwald Place. At least Septimus was being cared for by Sam's parents, Lily and James, that night, and he didn't have to worry about the boy now, or feel the wretchedness of leaving him alone with only a pork charm as his means of reaching him. Despite his best endeavors, here in the gloom Cleus's tired mind began to switch back to that evening's reciprocator meeting, fraught and complicated. Septimus had been knocking around with Sam upstairs, something Cleus always encouraged, for Sam was a decent lad, and he had urged his nephew to share some of the woes he had talked to Cleus about that evening. Septimus was worried about his mother and Sam. Septimus had told him later, had encouraged him to write her a letter or send her an owl. That seemed to cheer Septimus up, and, quiet and thoughtful, the boy had followed Cleus into the kitchen from the outside steps of the cottage to help him with dinner, a little more buoyant than he had been when they had both left that afternoon. That was, right up until the moment Freya Mitchell, Septimus's adopted sister, had arrived at the cottage. Cleus knew that Septimus had buried his feelings about his mother and Freya deep inside. He knew the boy knew that something had happened between them, and that was what had prompted Cecilia to leave. But Freya had merely stopped by for a chat and a catch-up, and Cleus had been relieved to hear them talking about their early years spent living in Edgeford, walks and trips they had been on, things they had done together. Over dinner the three of them had talked of happier times, with Cleus chipping in about the memories he had of when they were both small. Freya had then gone on to talk about Dudley Dursley, Petunia and Regulus Black's elder son. Septimus knew they had a younger son, Daron, whom he had met once before, and, once Freya had departed back to Tunks's house, where she now lived, he had gone on to wonder aloud to Cleus whether Dudley and Freya would be getting married. "Girls always think about getting married," said Septimus as he helped his Uncle Kay with the washing up when Cleus asked why he had asked. "I remember her talking about the types of dresses she and her friends would wear when they got married. I remember when she used to dress up and pretend she was wearing a wedding dress." Cleus had glanced down to look at Septimus, who, far from exclaiming the fact, was speaking of it matter-of-factly. "Crystalia was looking at wedding dresses when we all were last in Diagonally. But it doesn't mean she's thinking of getting married, though." Ha ha. Cleus had laughed silently to himself at his nephew's adroit observations. With such insight into women, lad, Cleus had thought as he had dried the dishes, "You'll go far. And you'll be there to see him go far, brother of mine," he said softly as he continued to hold Remus's near lifeless hand. "He'll be, oh, a great wizard. He'll be an earth wizard. Herbs or beasts will be his medium, you mark my words. I've seen him out with you, on the mountains with the whole of nature wild around him, as if waiting for his command. Cutting off, Cleus smiled a little at the healer who had come to change the drip which was feeding into Remus's left arm. "It's so good he's had visitors," she commented as she lifted down a vial of almost certainly not congealed wine, puncturing its lid and inverting it, resting it on the stand adjacent the bed. "Not like some." We've had some people down here for months without anyone. Even when we've let them go, they've gone on their own." She shook her head, her dark curls, bound tightly under a peaked cap, shook madly at the back. "Mr. Lupin here has been very lucky. Indeed. We all care for him so much." "And was that his son you brought the other day?" Callias nodded. "I thought it best for him to see his father. He would worry, otherwise. Especially when Freya spoiled an otherwise perfect afternoon with her brother by telling him how bad she felt for treating Cecilia that way, and that perhaps, if she hadn't, his mother might be there now and that she might have not gone away in the first place." "Thank you, Miss Mitchell," thoughtlessly put, as usual. He watched as the nurse tended Remus, wiping his brow, checking his pulse and taking his temperature before noting it down remotely by way of a quill, writing down the vital information as she took it onto a chart which was hanging at the foot of the bed. She smiled at Cleus briefly before crossing over to where the still body of Sirius lay. "Couldn't you stay too?" Septimus had asked of Callias, his face serious, his expression hopeful when it had been agreed that he could sleep over at the reciprocator headquarters in Sam's room after the meeting. Callias had shook his head and explained that he had several hours of work to prepare for the next day for the ministry. After an understanding smile, Septimus had followed Sam upstairs and Cleus had left promptly. Thinking back to the meeting, he shuddered. Not that it had lasted long, but the atmosphere was weighed down with the absence of both Remus and Sirius, ill as they were, and the news that Cleus had brought that the ministry had not settled on a course of action yet had caused the difficult talks to descend to further depths of iciness. Even James's attempt at humour had been met with stony silence, so much so he had got up and strode into the kitchen, leaving the rest of the reciprocators to discuss the ever more complicated, imprecise courses of action that were open to them. Just before Septimus had come downstairs to meet him, before they left for dinner, James had insisted he discussed with Cleus privately the changes which the ministry were likely to make. The ministry still had to ratify the policy of Hedgewood's allowing non-wizards access to the school, delayed as it had been because of the more pressing emergency which were the rise in incidences of conflict between non-wizards and conjurists. The meeting, which was supposed to have happened that morning, had been delayed until Tuesday following news from the European Parliament on developments they were making as a result of conjurist attacks and those by other wizard fundamentalists. As the head of the European Relations Department, it was his responsibility to distill the information to the ministry, and he was unable to do this until after his meeting on Monday evening. This meant that he had to delay deploying the reciprocators to liaise between the primary schools of prospective non-wizard students and instead redirect them to assist with monitoring of potential violent hotspots, sports events, public meetings, legal hearings, coven assemblies. There was no clear roles for any of them. They supposed, and agreed upon, that they would be there to assist the Euros as and when they needed it. "Up until Tuesday, till you know what we need to do." Callias had nodded before narrowing his eyes as James handed him something, a rather weighty document bound with string. "As you requested. Projections of changes that Hedgewoods will need to accommodate non-wizards. You have a lot to do before September," he added as Cleus untied the string and flicked through the recommendations, combed through for every infinitesimally small detail and leaving no stone unturned. "I won't be alone." Callias had bound the document with the string again before taking a thinner report, briefer, but lacking in no less detail. "Lily asked me to give you this. She apologizes for not being here this evening. She felt it necessary to be with Sirius and Remus." "Of course." Callias had nodded and looked through this document as his mind drifted vaguely to this room, with these people in it, caring for the abominably ill and hideously deformed, those people who so many had forsaken. Adjustments to the Hedgewoods curriculum for equality of opportunity for both wizards and non-wizards. Just as Cleus had wanted. From what he could see, Lily had made links between wizard and non-wizard subjects, offering suggestions into topics which could adequately both challenge the practical skills of wizards while supporting and contextualizing magic for non-wizards. A good deal about recent scientific and technological developments was included, a big nod towards her and Tabitha Penwright's reciprocator work. Then, of course, he had to feed back the information to Severus Snape, in order for him, as the headmaster of Hedgewood School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, to make the immediate changes that would be needed for non-wizards to attend. That, and the now legal, pan-European requirement that all professors at magical educational establishments to engage in academic research as part of the directive for commitment to community and society. The emphasis was based mainly around those academic areas which concerned non-wizards, so Hedgewood was well placed when it undertook the trial for the new syllabus that September. Would that he were a fly on the wall when Snape had that conversation with Professors Binns, Filch, and Trelawney, though. Callias shook his head. So much to do but with so little time to do it in. He needed another 24 hours, at least, on top of the 24 he already had to fit in all that he now needed to do. Of course, he could use a time turner. He had done just that before now when he needed a few extra hours, but it took its toll in the end. You ended up borrowing future time that way. All a time turner did was delay the inevitable. But he had Septimus to consider, especially now, what with both his parents absent. He let go of Remus's hand. His brother, lying there, so sick and ill, with little hope of recovery. Yes, he was well tended. If all it took was regular attention from those he cared about, he would be up and about, fully cured by now. But it wasn't that simple. And the person who really needed to be there with him was the one person who was missing. There were grave concerns of those ministers in the know, Malfoy, the Mullins, Drick and himself, which he had not shared with the reciprocators. All who knew of the circumstances surrounding Cecilia Frobisher's appearance nearly 12 years before were deeply concerned about the disappearance without a trace of Cecilia Lupin from Durmstrang Institute. The tense nature of the meeting that night had kept Cleus from speaking about their concerns, and no one had mentioned her either, despite all present knowing about the situation. Callias was glad Sirius was not awake right at that moment, because he would have probably experienced apoplexy at the mention of her name. He had not taken Cecilia's presence in their lives too well, changing as he had done from indifference to annoyance when she had used the information he had provided about his family to validate the research carried out by Snape on the Universal Link and made personal comments about each and every one of them. This had given way to exasperation and finally to what Cleus could only describe as hatred on her final confrontation with them all at the last meeting she had attended nearly 2 years before. How he had stopped himself from cursing her Cleus to this day never knew. Though it was hardly Cecilia's fault, she had been distraught that Snape had let her go FRM her position at Hedgewood's when it was reorganized following Aberforth's death, making redundant her research. She hadn't wanted to leave Septimus and had some anger towards Cleus over his decision over her future. The fact was, however, that there was a huge fissure in the ever-reliable reciprocators caused by Cecilia confronting them, and she had, in her own particular intrusive, blunt, abrupt manner, not won many friends over the years. Indeed, she had several enemies, or at least people who would be her downfall given half a chance. To give Cecilia her due, however, though she had gone to Durmstrang reluctantly, he knew that she did what she felt was necessary, and probably more, no matter the danger. She wouldn't be Cecilia if she didn't. It was heart or soul or nothing. A deep intake of breath caused Cleus to look at his brother. No. He was just breathing again, his chest rising and falling with just a deeper inhalation interrupting uncompromising rhythm. If only Remus knew how much loyalty he had inspired in the reciprocators, his friends. And Sirius too. Lily and James had visited on more occasions than was their share, as had the Weasley family, Diggle and Bradle, Sturgis Podmore and Shacklebolt. If only you knew how you were loved, my brother, said Cleus to himself. Not least by me. In another part of his mind he housed his guilt over the mission he and Sirius were on. But consummate a politician that he was, it was sectioned in his mind away from the here and now. The box would open, he knew, but he had too much on at the present to allow time to waste on his emotions. And what of your wife? Were she here? He knew Cecilia would be at his side, sharing her time talking to Remus and shouting and cursing at Cleus for his role in Remus's condition. Vociferous indeed. Where she was now was, ultimately, his greatest concern, and it had been since the moment she had arrived, not least that the memories accessible from behind the veil, which only Cecilia to this day had ever survived, and through which media the Pensives were now being used for communication. Some would say she would have been better kept from the world, some had. But Aberforth, as usual, had got his way in the end for the sake of humanity and the better world towards which they were working. Aberforth was now gone and the responsibility lay with him. No matter his silky words almost 12 years ago, if he had known what he did now, she would never have left the ministry. Even the reciprocators had questioned his judgment, not that of Aberforth. He had noted bitterly when he had chanced upon a conversation late one night at Grimmauld Place shortly after the Cecilia incident, shortly after Aberforth had died. They had been swayed by Aberforth's vision, James had said. And, why had she ever turned up on their doorstep? Why was she still there? Why had she never left? Cleus knew, however, that no one would question him to his face, for there was still a measure of protocol, and Cleus had never seen any point in bringing it up. And besides, what would he imprison her for? What could he say she had done? He looked across at Remus. But in turn, as he had made her, as a spy at Durmstrang, had he not, in effect, imprisoned her? Cold, and political, yes. Cleus had been called much worse. But he made her see her purpose was useful, valuable, irreplaceable. And, of course, he had torn her away from her family. She wasn't the only missing person. Tabitha Penright hadn't been seen since June, although her absence was entirely more explainable, given her methods of investigating her mysteries. If Miss Penright's traits were displayed by anyone else, they would be described as erratic, strange and unpredictable. But she got results, and she was good. No, Tabitha would resurface, sooner or later, probably under armed giant guard, believing it to be the day before yesterday. At least she would have her say on Lily's report on old magic. Tabitha had contributed a lot to the content, and when she did finally read, her comments could be taken into account. Along with Lily's recommendations, her preliminary report had been enclosed. The ministry had agreed to accept it without corroboration from Tabitha Penright, quite simply because she was engaged in ministry business. And the fact that Harry and Hermione were in Strasbourg meant they would probably bring back a report from Henrietta Edwards, their contact in the European Parliament, regarding the Conjurist situation on the continent. No, it wasn't all bad, and nothing he couldn't handle. He looked at his brother again, his mind quietening. Perhaps he could have brought Septimus this evening. The lad had spent the second of his 2 visits, unlike the first, taking to his father about his last few days at school and what he had been doing that summer. Septimus's helps and fears about Edwards might have been enough to rouse Remus, perhaps, or at least provoke some sort of response. Cleus got to his feet and began to pace Aberforth between Remus and Sirius's beds. Poor Septimus. He knew his nephew deserved far more than he could provide, family that he was or not. Despite his omniscience, he had such a blind spot for Septimus, and he knew this to be a personal weakness. No other 11-year-old he would have sanctioned coming here, no other child. If Sirius had had children, he would have upheld the hospital's policy on health and safety. If the patients down here had their health, then no visitor had their safety. He wondered if Remus would be surprised if he knew just how important his son was. He knew about Cecilia's past, of course, one of only a handful that did. But what would he make of Aberforth's speculation? That's if he ever recovered. If he recovered and the situation was less than critical at the ministry, Cleus resolved to share a little more with his brother. A safe bet considering the circumstances. Even in the dim light, Cleus could see the huge gouge marks on Remus's neck where the illegal vampire had struck. He knew from reports from the so-called owners, now guests at Azkaban, that both he and Sirius had done their best to fight off the attacks, coming so swiftly and unexpectedly when they entered the suspected conjurist's house. And now, almost a week later, neither had moved save a few heavier breaths and a couple of flinches. The nurses were doing their best too. Their care could not be better. But, of course, Sirius had the far better chance. Once he regained consciousness, Severus Snape could brew the potion that he had done for Cleus, and, when a full moon presented itself or, even better, a lunar eclipse, the parasites in his blood would be completely eradicated by the silver nitrate, the active ingredient, in the cure. Then all Sirius would have to do was to take the monthly symptom-relieving potions like Cleus did. The parasite's influence of causing the moon to interact with the water in a wizard's cells, unfortunate as he had been that he had been bitten by a werewolf, still, with the absence of aforementioned tiny beasts, still responded to the moon's influence, but to a far diminished extent. It was the difference between a slight tiredness of the eyes and a light-sensitive, nausea-inducing migraine. Often Cleus wondered whether Snape had gone to the trouble of developing it only because he could. On thinking such thoughts, Cleus tended, because of the plain vitalness of Snape's potion-making abilities, and also because he held equal status with him in the reciprocator movement. Aberforth had been specific in leaving the Hedgewood's responsibilities to Snape, as was the school tradition to name a successor, for he had access to the same knowledge as Cleus himself. The most brilliant thing that Severus Snape had done was to continue to marvel and astonish almost every academic and professional institution he had ever been in contact with. There was little he could not do in any given field, although his social skills and personableness were definitely areas to work on. Snape had come up with the lycanthropy cure by himself, calculated the correct dosage, established a viable matrix in which the silver nitrate to stabilize it and prevent it from decaying, and formed a symptom reliever all by the age of 12. Usually eminent and skilled wizards took years, decades, to perfect what Severus had achieved in the matter of months, and this was but a doxy-dropping hill compared to the Everest he had conquered, namely the universal link between wizards and non-wizards. So if anyone could help his dear brother, it was Severus. But there was one factor which hadn't escaped Cleus's notice. All potions which required metal salts as the active ingredient were stabilized by the root of a plant which had to be picked at the right time, when it flowered at night, and grew in only one place in the world. The effect of this was to make potions very expensive, even on the Wizard Health Service, and also very valuable. Because of its scarcity, the small, otherwise inconsequential primrose plant was also sought by black marketeers, corrupt governments, drugs and armament manufacturers. Not so bad when, as a politician, you could pull a few strings. But, reports, independently verified reports, stated that the source had been harvested almost clear of the primroses and had been sealed off by the Mongolian government. The chances of getting some were about as good as Remus miraculously waking up with no ill effects whatsoever. Cleus looked at his sleeping brother again before sitting back down next to him, taking his hand. This wasn't about to deter Severus Snape, however. When he came across a problem, especially one as stubborn and impossible as this, Cleus knew that the wizard would be spurred on by the challenge. He held tighter to Remus's hand. Was he asking too much, that the brilliant Severus Snape? Had he asked too much already? Was he able to reliably aid his brother's recovery as he had helped him? Cleus closed his eyes, chewing away all thoughts of the Azkaban high pile of work with his name on. Snape had to come up with something, and fast, so that Remus could wake up. For Septimus's sake?